In today's video we will go over why I think the news media is trying to divide the country, with proof. But before we get into the video, please subscribe, like, and share. Reasons young adults think the news media is dividing our country. Let's just start by saying, I have been on a media detox since May. Instead of watching the news on TV, I started reading the papers. A new report released by Knight Foundation shows that young adults are concerned about the impact of news on democracy and unity in the country, expressing that news sources divide and polarize citizens. Many young adults believe news sources, even their favorite source, have a liberal or conservative ideological slant. The survey asked a series of questions about young adults' most and least liked news sources in order to understand their opinion about specific outlets they use, rather than just their general attitudes about the news media. Majorities of young adults see both their most and least liked sources as having a particular ideological leaning. Overall, about 45% of young adults say their most liked news source is neither liberal nor conservative, whereas 42% say it is liberal and 13% say it is conservative. They are much more likely to see their least liked source as holding a conservative slant. Only 23% feel their least liked source is neutral. There are stark differences based on young adults' political affiliations. Democrats are especially likely to perceive an ideological slant to their most and least liked favorite sources. 57% of Democrats see their favorite news source as liberal, while 36% of Republicans perceive their favorite news source as very or somewhat conservative. Also, more Democrats say their least liked source is very conservative than Republicans say their least liked source is very liberal, 75% versus 68%. Dispelling the notion that young adults don't pay attention to news, a new survey shows 88% of people ages 18 to 34 access news at least weekly, including 53% who do so every day. Hispanic and Black young adults are more likely to share news with friends on social media. Young adults of all races are highly digital news consumers, finding their news on social media, smartphone alerts or news websites. The most popular reasons young adults share news are because they find it interesting, helpful, or entertaining. However, highly partisan young adults are more likely than their peers to share news that confirms with others' opinions. Young adults often do not believe that their race or ethnicity is covered regularly in the media, even in their favorite news sources. In addition, a sizable portion of young adults, especially many Hispanics and African Americans, say they see inaccuracies and irregularities in the coverage of their racial or ethnic communities. The findings come from a recent Knight Foundation survey conducted by NORC at the University of Chicago. The nationally representative survey of 1,660 adults age 18-34 includes oversamples of African Americans and Hispanics in order to explore news behavior and beliefs of young adults within and across races and ethnicities. In addition, the study measures the impact of personal identities and psychological predispositions on young adults' perceptions of news and news behaviors. And young adults are more likely to say their least liked source divides the country than they are to say their favorite news source unites the country, even though most people rarely interact with their least liked source. Young adults are more likely to have strong negative views of their least liked source than positive views of their favorite source. About 45% say their favorite source is neither liberal nor conservative, while 75% say their least liked source is liberal or conservative. The findings also illustrate that ethnic news media is a key source for young Hispanic and African Americans, particularly those who have strong beliefs about race and personal experience with discrimination. Young African Americans and Hispanics who say they regularly experience racial discrimination are more likely to seek out racial or ethnic media sources that explore issues from their perspective. A majority of young adults use their favorite news source at least a moderate amount to decide what candidates to vote for and what policies to support, and young African Americans are especially likely to act on information from the media. Young adults with strong partisan and racial identities are more likely to rely on news to make decisions. Strong political partisans are also more likely. Strong political partisans are the most likely to rely on news for decision-making. Both party identification and identifying as either a strong Democrat or strong Republican are tied to how young adults rely on their news to make decisions. Strong partisans are more likely than independents, and those who don't strongly identify with either political party to rely on news sources to choose what policies or candidates to support. Democrats are the most likely to use their favorite news source quite a bit to decide what policies to support, followed by Republicans, then independent. 34% versus 23% versus 14%. Similarly, 28% of Democrats say they rely on their favorite news source to choose what candidates to support, compared with only 15% of independents. 21% of Republicans say the same. Majorities of young adults rely on a favored news source to make decisions, and African Americans are particularly likely to act on news. Many young adults make decisions about what candidates and policies to support based on news from their favorite sources, while few rely on less trusted outlets. In order to understand how young adults use news, the survey asked young adults to name their most liked and least liked news source, and then explored how these specific sources impacted their decision-making. More than 6 in 10 young adults report relying on their most liked source at least a moderate amount when deciding whether to support or oppose a policy, including nearly 3 in 10 who say they rely on it quite a bit or a great deal. More than half use their favorite news source at least a moderate amount to decide what candidate to vote for. And more than 4 in 10 use their favorite source to determine where to volunteer their time or donate money. Only about 1 in 10 young adults say they rely on their least liked source when deciding to either vote for a candidate, support a policy, or volunteer their time or donate money. As young adults question the media's coverage of race, many Hispanics and African Americans get news from ethnic media sources. Young Hispanics and African Americans frequently use sources that focus on providing news specific to a racial or ethnic community. When asked on how regularly they use such ethnic media sources, a majority of African American, 58%, and Hispanic, 52%, young adults say that they use these news sources at least once a week, including 26% of African Americans and 18% of Hispanics who use these news sources at least once a day. Racial identity is important to those young adults that use such media sources. Young African Americans and Hispanics who feel a sense of linked fate, that is, that what happens to others of their race or ethnicity has an impact on them, are more likely than those who don't to use such racial or ethnic news sources at least once a week, 63% versus 43%. Self-reported experience with racial discrimination is another factor in ethnic media consumption. Young African Americans and Hispanics who say they regularly experience racial discrimination are more likely than those who don't regularly experience this to use racial or ethnic media. The findings indicate the experiencing racial discrimination could lead young adults to be more likely to seek out news sources that explore issues from the perspective of their racial or ethnic group. Many young Hispanics and African Americans do not feel like the news portrays their race or ethnicity accurately. When asked about how accurately their most and least liked sources portray their race and ethnicity, young African Americans and Hispanics are critical of both. Only 45% of African Americans and 40% of Hispanics say their most liked source very accurately portrays them. But their least liked sources fare even worse on this measure. About 6 in 10 in both groups say their least liked source portrays them slightly or not at all accurately. Young Hispanics are more likely to see the media's portrayal of them as accurate when they have a strong sense of linked fate. Hispanic young adults that believe what happens to other Hispanics impacts them, i.e. a sense of linked fate, are more likely to say that their most liked source accurately portrays the people and issues that affect Hispanics, 51% versus 28%. In addition, 49% of Hispanics that feel being Hispanic is an important or essential part of their identity say that their most liked source accurately portrays Hispanics, compared with 21% of those who do not have such a strong identity. However, this impact of racial identity and linked fate does not extend to African Americans. Young people are worried about the impacts of their least liked sources on democracy. In addition to the perceived ideological bias of their least liked source, many young people worry about the impact these sources are having on the country. When it comes to feelings of division in the country, young adults are more likely to say their least liked news source divides the country than they are to say their favorite news source unites the country. Overall, 73% say their least liked source divides the country, and only 47% say their favorite source helps unite it. When comparing partisan attitudes, 51% of Democrats say their favorite source unites the public, while 42% of Republicans say the same. Young adults also perceive differences in the makeup of these sources' audiences, suggesting concerns that the news is adding to polarization. 42% say Democrats are likely to use their most liked source, compared with 24% who say the same about Republicans. For their least liked source, it's the opposite. 46% say Republicans are likely to use it, 23% for Democrats. But between partisans this difference is more evident. 60% of Democrats think their most liked source is likely to be used by Democrats, and 73% say their least liked source is predominantly used by Republicans. 42% of Republicans think their most liked source is also used by Republicans, while 55% think their least liked source is used by Democrats. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. Also comment down below. What do you think about the news media trying to divide the country?